The year is 1944. The place is a quiet farm in Wisconsin. The wind blows cold across the empty cornfields. Usually, this time of year is full of life. Usually, young men are out in the dirt, laughing and working. But today, the fields are silent. The young men of Wisconsin are gone. They are thousands of miles away, fighting a war that seems to have no end. Inside a small farmhouse, a mother sits at a wooden table. Her hands are shaking. She holds a yellowed telegram from the War Department. "We regret to inform you." The words are like a knife. Her son, Tommy, is never coming home. He died in a muddy trench in Europe. He was killed by a German soldier. To this mother, every German is a monster. Every German is a murderer. But then, a loud noise breaks the silence of the farm. A cloud of dust rises from the dirt road. A large military truck rumbles toward the house. It stops right in the driveway. The engine coughs and dies. Evelyn, the daughter of the house, stands by the window. She is only 19 years old. Her eyes are red for crying for her brother. She watches as the back of the truck opens. American guards jump down first. They carry heavy rifles. They look serious. Then the prisoners begin to climb out. They wear gray wool jackets. On their backs, the letters POW are painted in bright, ugly white. These are German soldiers. These are the Nazi beasts the radio warns everyone about. The government has a plan. The crops are rotting. There are no American men left to harvest the food. So, they brought the enemy to their backyard. Evelyn's mother looks out the window. She sees the gray uniforms. She sees the faces of the men who belong to the army that killed her son. She screams at them through the glass. She calls them animals. She wants them gone. But Evelyn stays quiet. She watches one prisoner in particular. His name is Hans. He is thin. He looks tired. He doesn't look like a monster from a movie. He looks like a boy. He looks exactly like her brother, Tommy. As Hans steps onto the Wisconsin soil, he looks up. For one split second, his eyes meet Evelyn's. In that moment, the war disappeared. There is no Hitler. There is no Roosevelt. There is only a girl with a broken heart and a boy with a broken spirit. This is the beginning of the most disgraceful secret in American history. This is the story of how 50 local girls did the unthinkable. They didn't just talk to the enemy. They didn't just feed the enemy. They fell in love with them. They chose to betray their families. They chose to betray their country. And they did it all for the men working in their own backyards. Evelyn was not a rebel. She was a farm girl. She was the kind of girl who woke up before the sun to milk the cows. She knew the smell of damp earth and the sound of a tractor better than she knew the words to a love song. Before the war, her life was mapped out. Her brother, Tommy, would run the farm. She would help. They would grow the business. Life was simple. But war is a thief. It steals sons and it steals futures. Now the weight of the entire world sat on Evelyn's shoulders. Her father's back was broken from years of hard labor. Her mother was lost in a fog of grief. If the corn didn't get picked, the bank would take the house. If the harvest failed, they would lose everything Tommy had died to protect. Evelyn's objective was survival, pure and simple.
She didn't care about politics. She didn't care about the newsreels playing in the city. She just needed hands, strong hands to pull the corn from the stalks. She needed the enemy to save her family. But there was a problem. You cannot work inches away from a person and see only a uniform. You cannot watch a man sweat under the same sun as you and see only a beast. Evelyn tried to be cold. She tried to hate them. She told herself one of these men might have pulled the trigger. One of these men might be the reason Tommy's bed is empty. She walked into the fields with her head down. She refused to look at their faces. She focused on the work. But the mind plays tricks. In the silence of the fields, she heard them. They weren't shouting war cries. They were humming folk songs. They were talking about their own mothers back in Bavaria. They were human, and that was the most dangerous thing of all.
The conflict began with a law. The U.S. government was afraid. They were bringing thousands of German soldiers into the heart of America. They knew these men were young. They knew the local girls were lonely. So they created a wall made of words. It was called non-fraternization. The rules were printed on posters in every post office. You could not speak to a prisoner. You could not give them a cigarette. You could not even offer a smile. To the government, these men were weapons that had been put in a cage. To the townspeople, they were a disease. The local sheriff patrolled the farm roads. He didn't just watch the prisoners, he watched the girls. He looked for a lingering glance. He looked for a note hidden in a lunch bucket. The tension in Wisconsin was thick as you could touch. On one side of the fence were the Nazis. On the other side were the patriots. And in the middle was a growing, burning curiosity. Evelyn felt the conflict every time she stepped onto the porch. Her mother would stand behind her, clutching a photo of Tommy. Her mother's eyes were like ice. She watched the Germans in the field like a hawk watches a mouse. "Don't you go near them, Evelyn," her mother whispered. "They have blood on their hands. If you speak to them, you are spitting on your brother's grave." This was Evelyn's war. It wasn't fought with tanks or planes. It was fought in her own heart. Every time Hans, the young German prisoner, looked her way, she felt a bolt of guilt. She felt like a traitor. But every time she saw him struggle with a heavy crate, she felt a different urge. She wanted to help. The town was a powder keg. The neighbors whispered over backyard fences. They talked about the girls who looked too long. They called them names. They threatened to shave their heads if they caught them talking to the Krauts. The law said, "Stay away." Her mother said, "Hate them." The town said, "Watch out." But the corn was tall, the guards were tired, and the heart doesn't follow the laws of the government. The conflict was no longer about the war in Europe. It was about the war in Wisconsin. Falling in love is usually easy, but for Evelyn and Hans, it was almost impossible. Between them stood the first wall, the fence. It was made of barbed wire and wood. It was a physical reminder that one was a free citizen and the other was property of the state. To touch that wire was to risk being shot by a guard. Then there was the second wall, the language. Evelyn spoke English. Hans spoke German. To Evelyn,
German sounded like the harsh barking of orders she heard on the news. To Hans, English sounded like the language of the people who had bombed his city. How do you tell someone you are sorry? How do you tell someone you are lonely when you don't have the words? They had to find a new way to speak. They used their eyes. They used their hands. One day, while working near the edge of the field, Hans tripped. He fell hard into the dirt. A crate of apples spilled everywhere. The American guard stepped forward, his hand on his holster. He shouted at Hans to get up. Evelyn was standing nearby. She saw the fear in Hans's eyes. She didn't think about the law. She didn't think about her brother. She just leaned down and began picking up the apples. Her hand brushed against his. It was a split second, a tiny moment of skin touching skin, but it felt like an electric shock. In that moment, the language barrier didn't matter. The fence didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the warmth of another human being. But the biggest wall was the watchers. In a small town, everyone knows everything. The neighbors didn't just look at the prisoners, they looked at the girls. They watched for a girl who stayed in the field too long. They watched for a girl who smiled at a gray uniform. Evelyn felt their eyes on the back of her neck every time she walked to the village store. The whispers were like poison. "There she goes," they would say. "The girl who likes the Nazis, the girl who forgot her brother." Every night, Evelyn went to bed with a heavy heart. She was surrounded by walls, barriers of wire, barriers of words, and barriers of hate. To understand why the enemy was in Wisconsin at all, you have to understand the desperation of 1944. America was winning the war, but it was losing the battle at home. The country was running out of food. Why? Because the farmers were gone. Millions of young American men were overseas. The crops were growing, but there was no one to harvest them. The U.S. government faced a crisis. If the harvest failed, the army would starve. If the army starved, the war would be lost. They had to make a deal with the devil. Across the Atlantic, the Allies were capturing thousands of German soldiers every day. They had too many prisoners and not enough food to feed them in Europe, so they loaded them onto ships. Nearly 400,000 German soldiers were sent to the United States. They were spread across 500 camps in almost every state. In Wisconsin, the situation was perfect for the government. The state was famous for its dairy and its vegetables. The farmers were desperate. The government offered them a deal. "We will give you the labor you need. We will give you the Germans." At first, the farmers were terrified. They expected monsters. They expected men who would burn down their barns or kill their families in their sleep. But when the trucks arrived, they didn't see monsters. They saw hungry, tired, and scared young men. Most of them weren't even Nazis. They were just boys who had been drafted into a war they didn't understand. The government called it the Emergency Farm Labor Program. They thought they could control it. They thought they could bring the enemy in, use their muscles, and then throw them away. They thought they could keep the Krauts and the American girls apart with simple rules and barbed wire. They were wrong. The government forgot one thing. You can't put two groups of young people in a field together and expect them to remain enemies forever. Nature is stronger than any military order. The necessary evil was about to become a social disaster.
To understand this story, you have to look past the gray wool jackets. You have to look at the people inside them. Let's look at Evelyn. She wasn't a girl who went looking for trouble. She was the anchor of her family. After her brother Tommy died, her mother stopped functioning. Her father worked until his hands bled. Evelyn was the one who kept the books. She was the one who made sure there was bread on the table. She was strong, but she was hollowed out by grief. She thought her heart was closed forever. Then there was Hans. In his hometown in Bavaria, Hans was a dreamer. He loved to draw. He wanted to be an architect. But when the war came, the Nazi Party didn't ask him for his permission. They handed him a rifle and a helmet. They sent him to the front lines. He wasn't a hero. He was a survivor. When the Americans captured him, he felt a strange sense of relief. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was alive. Hans was not the monster Evelyn's mother talked about. He was a boy who missed his sister. He was a boy who hated the sound of gunfire. He carried a small folded piece of paper in his pocket. It was a drawing he had made of his family's farm. It was the only thing he had left of his old life. And then there was the mother. She is an important part of this story. She represents the pain of America. She represents every mother who lost a son to a German bullet. To her, there was no good German. There was only the enemy. Her hatred wasn't just anger, it was a shield. If she accepted that Hans was a human being, she would have to accept that her son's death was a tragedy, not just a sacrifice for a noble cause. These three people lived on the same patch of dirt. One was fueled by duty, one by survival, and one by hate. It was a recipe for disaster.
The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in small, quiet moments during the long, hot days of the 1944 harvest. It started with the water. The sun in Wisconsin can be brutal. The prisoners worked from dawn to dusk. They were given water, but it was never enough. One afternoon, Evelyn saw Hans wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked like he was about to collapse. Evelyn walked to the well. She filled a tin cup with cold water. She knew the rules. She knew the guard was watching, but she also knew what it felt like to be thirsty. She walked to the edge of the fence and set the cup on a wooden post. She didn't say a word. She just walked away. Hans took the cup. He drank the water. He looked at her back as she walked toward the house. That was the first crack in the wall. A week later, Evelyn found a small piece of wood sitting on that same post. Someone had carved it. It was a tiny wooden bird. It was beautiful. She knew it was from Hans. She hid it in her pocket. She felt a rush of fear, but also a rush of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Soon, the no fraternization rule began to crumble all over Wisconsin. It wasn't just Evelyn. In farms across the state, local girls were finding ways to connect with the prisoners. They began to develop a secret code. A certain way of hanging laundry on the line meant the guards are gone. A specific bird whistle meant I have a letter for you. They hid notes in the husks of the corn. They tucked cigarettes into the pockets of the prisoners' jackets while they were hanging in the barn. They were building a secret society right under the noses of the U.S. Army. One night, Evelyn waited until her parents were asleep. She crept out of the house. She walked to the barn. Hans was there, sitting on a hay bale.
He had been given permission to fix a broken plow. For the first time, they spoke. It wasn't perfect. It was a mix of broken English and German signs. Hans told her about the mountains in Germany. Evelyn told him about Tommy. They cried together in the dark. In that barn, there were no flags, there were no uniforms. There were just two lonely people in the middle of a world that wanted them to be enemies. But as their love grew, so did the danger. The town was starting to notice. The harvest of secrets was about to become a public scandal.
By the fall of 1944, the Wisconsin harvest was a massive success. The grain bins were overflowing. The canning factories were working day and night. On the surface, the town was a picture of American patriotism. The local newspapers ran headlines praising the farmers. They even thanked the government for the efficient use of labor. The town leaders held a festival. They hung red, white, and blue banners from every lamppost. They cheered for the American spirit that saved the crops. But there was a great lie sitting at the center of the celebration. The townspeople looked at the German prisoners and saw tools. They saw machines in human form that did the work no one else wanted to do. They truly believed their daughters and sisters were safe behind the no fraternization rules. They believed the hate was strong enough to keep everyone apart. This was the dramatic irony of Wisconsin. While the fathers were at the festival drinking cider and bragging about the harvest, their daughters were in the shadows of the barns, sharing their first kisses with the enemy. The town was celebrating a victory, but they were losing a generation of women. They thought they had captured the Germans. In reality, the Germans had captured the hearts of the town's youth. The very men the town wanted to use and then throw away were becoming the most important people in these girls' lives. The older generation was blind, and that blindness was about to lead to a massive explosion of anger.
Evelyn wasn't alone. She soon realized that a secret war was happening in almost every farm in the county. It started with small signals. Evelyn would see her friend Sarah at the market. Sarah would lean in and whisper, "He likes chocolate. If you can find any, hide it in the hollow tree near the creek." These girls created an underground network. It was as organized as any military operation. They traded tips on how to distract the guards. They shared German to English dictionaries. They even set up a system to smuggle letters. Because the prisoners' mail was censored by the army, the girls became the secret post office. A girl from one farm would take a letter from a prisoner, hide it in her dress, and give it to a girl on another farm. They were the bridge between the camps and the world. But they weren't just passing notes. They were planning a future. In the quiet hours of the night, Evelyn and Hans made a pact. Hans told her that the war was ending. He knew Germany was losing. He told her about the ruins of his home. He told her he had nothing to go back to. "Stay here," Evelyn whispered. "We can find a way." But Hans shook his head. "The government won't let me stay. When the guns stop, they will send us back. I am a prisoner. I belong to the state." That was the planning stage. The girls weren't just falling in love. They were preparing for a fight. They started saving money. They started hiding civilian clothes. They knew that when the war ended, their real struggle would begin. They were no longer just farm girls. They were rebels. They were choosing a side, and it wasn't the side of the American government. They were choosing the side of their hearts.
And then the news came. The war in Europe was over. The enemy in the backyard was no longer needed. The order was given. Clear the camps, send them home. The secret was about to meet the light of day, and the town was not going to be kind.
May 1945. The bells in the Wisconsin town squares rang until they cracked. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was over. People danced in the streets. They burned effigies of the enemy. But on the farms, there was no dancing. There was only a cold, paralyzing fear. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and watched the trucks arrive. This time, they didn't come to bring workers. They came to take them away. The U.S. government was clearing the camps. The enemy in the backyard was being sent back to a country that lay in ruins. This was the tension peak. The secret could no longer stay in the shadows. As the guards began rounding up the men, the girls of Wisconsin broke. They didn't care about the laws anymore. They didn't care about their reputations. Sarah, Evelyn's friend, ran to the fence and grabbed the hand of a young German named Peter. She was screaming. She was begging the guards to let him stay. The townspeople watched in total shock. The neighbors, the store owners, and the veterans, everyone saw the truth. The disgrace was finally public. The culmination of the story happened at the local train station. Hundreds of German prisoners were being loaded onto cattle cars, but they weren't alone. Dozens of local girls were there too. They weren't cheering for the end of the war. They were weeping. Evelyn's mother stood on the platform. She saw Evelyn trying to push through the crowd to reach Hans. Her mother's face was a mask of pure betrayal. "If you go to him," her mother shouted over the noise of the steam engine, "you are dead to this family. You are a traitor to your brother's memory." Evelyn stopped. She looked at her mother. Then she looked at Hans, whose face was pressed against the wooden slats of the train car. In that moment, the resolution was born. Evelyn didn't choose the past. She didn't choose the hate. She chose the man. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered. The train pulled away. The girls were left standing on the tracks, covered in soot and shame. The town turned its back on them. They were called kraut lovers. They were spit on in the streets. But they had made a pact. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a long journey into the dark. The action of those final days was a blur of motion and sound. Imagine the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors, the sound of the guards shouting orders in a language the girls barely understood, the sound of the train's whistle, which sounded like a death knell for 50 different hearts. There was the physical struggle. Girls were being held back by their fathers. Some were locked in their rooms to keep them from the station. There were frantic hands reaching through barbed wire, trying to touch one last time. There were small items thrown from the train windows, rings made of scrap metal, locks of hair, and scraps of paper with addresses written in pencil. But the most intense action happened after the train left. The girls didn't just sit and cry. They moved. They acted. Evelyn went to the local library. She spent every hour she had studying maps of a destroyed Germany. She worked 3 jobs. She saved every penny. She ignored the stones thrown at her windows. Across Wisconsin, 49 other girls were doing the same thing. They were writing letters to the Red Cross. They were bothering government officials. They were fighting through a mountain of paperwork.
The government tried to stop them. They told the girls that Germany was a wasteland. They told them there was no food, no electricity, and no hope. They told them they would lose their American citizenship if they married the enemy. But the girls didn't listen. They packed their suitcases. They traded their comfortable American lives for a one-way ticket to a country of ghosts. The activity was relentless. It was a race against time and a race against a world that wanted them to forget. They were 50 women against an entire nation, and they were winning.
What is the theme of this story? Is it just about romance? No. It is about something much deeper. It is about the thin line between an enemy and a human. The government spent years and millions of dollars teaching Americans to hate Germans. They used posters, they used movies, they used the radio. They created a world where everything was black and white. You were either a patriot or a traitor. But Evelyn and the other 50 girls discovered a truth that the government couldn't control. They discovered that humanity is stronger than ideology. War is a machine that runs on hate. It needs us to see the other side as monsters so we can pull the trigger. But when you put two people in a field together, when they share the same sun, the same dirt, and the same hunger, the machine breaks down. These girls faced a massive moral conflict. They loved their country. They loved their brothers who died in the trenches. But they also loved the men who were standing right in front of them. They realized that Hans didn't choose the war. He was a victim of it, just like their brothers. By choosing to love him, Evelyn wasn't betraying Tommy. She was choosing a world where no more Tommies had to die. The theme is simple. The heart does not recognize borders. It does not read political posters. It only recognizes the soul of another person.
To see the unity of this story, we have to look back at the beginning. The story started with a fence. It was a fence designed to keep the beasts away from the innocent. It was a fence of fear. But by the end of the story, that fence had changed. It was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. It was the place where hands touched. It was the place where letters were passed. It was the place where a girl and a boy realized they were the same. The backyard is the center of this world. In the backyard, the war wasn't a map with red lines. It was a reality of sweat and corn silk. The story ends where it began, on the farm. But the farm is different now. The silence is gone. In its place is a question that haunts the town. Did the enemy invade Wisconsin, or did Wisconsin find its soul in the enemy? The narrative comes full circle. We see the same dirt, the same sky, and the same farmhouse, but the people inside have been changed forever. They are no longer just citizens of a town. They are citizens of a complicated, messy, and beautiful world.
So, what happened to them? This isn't a fairy tale. It is a true story. Between 1946 and 1948, nearly 50 women from Wisconsin did the unthinkable. They packed their bags. They left the comfort of America. They boarded ships and sailed across the ocean to a Germany that was a pile of gray rubble. They moved into basements with no heat.
They lived on turnip soup and black bread. They were hated by the Germans for being American. They were hated by the Americans for being traitor brides. They lived in the aftermath of the war they had tried to ignore. But they stayed. If you look at the old black and white photos from that time, you can see them. There is a photo of Evelyn and Hans in 1947. They are standing in front of a bombed-out church in Bavaria. Evelyn is wearing a simple white dress she made herself. Hans is smiling, a real smile this time. They stayed married for 60 years. They raised children who spoke 2 languages. They built a bridge between 2 nations that had tried to destroy each other. In Wisconsin, the town tried to forget. The records of the marriages were tucked away in old files. The names of the girls were whispered in shame for a few years, and then they were silenced. But the ghosts are still there. If you walk through those Wisconsin cornfields today, you might still find a tiny wooden bird carved from a fence post. You might find a rusted tin cup near an old well. The enemy in the backyard was never really an enemy. He was a mirror. He showed us that even in the middle of the greatest war in history, love is the only thing that survives the harvest. The video ends on a single question. If the man who killed your brother was standing in your backyard, hungry and cold, would you give him a cup of water, or would you turn away? The 50 girls of Wisconsin gave him the water, and the world was never the same.